Let's talk about one that's a little less chalk, but I think one that we're all excited about. And as I started to dig into this team a little bit more and their 2021 outlook, the LA Rams, man, last year their offensive line took a big jump up. That was one of our concerns going into 2020, was if their O-line could produce, could allow Cam Akers, Darrell Henderson, and Malcolm Brown to be able to move the chains on the ground. And they were able to do that. But everywhere else for this Rams offense, they were just average. They were slightly above average in many areas, right, in terms of like points per game, yards per game, both on the ground and through the air, but they weren't exceptional. There wasn't really a stat where they were top 5. And we know Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp have been staples at the wide receiver 2 position in fantasy rosters, on your fantasy lineup for years. And we were all over Robert Woods. Last year we had him as wide receiver 14 in our rankings before the season started. And then you have an emerging Cam Akers, who is averaging a whopping 24 touches a game for the Rams their last 6 games of the season. He's already going in the late first round in redraft. I don't mind that ADP there, even though I think we can pump the brakes a little bit. We'll talk about him, I'm sure, as the year goes on, as we get closer to when these drafts happen. But then this offense brings in one of the most prolific, air-it-out passers over the last decade in Matthew Stafford. They're going from a quarterback in Jared Goff, who was bottom 5 in air yards per pass attempt last year, to a quarterback who's been top 5 in air yards per attempt over the last 10 years. Stafford was a guy that just 2 years ago, you and I were shouting from the rooftops, this guy should be leading the MVP candidate voting when he was on pace for 5,000 yards and 50 touchdowns the first half of 2019. And his deep ball completion percentage, it's phenomenal. 42%, 38%, 43% the last 3 seasons. Compare that to Jared Goff, who's never been above 30%, even when he had Brandon Cooks with him on the field. So not only is Stafford going to be better at airing the ball out, he's a more prolific all-around quarterback with experience who can sustain drives. He can keep the offense on the field more, which means more fantasy points. And he has that clutch potential. I think there's going to be a lot of games this year where you're looking at your scoreboard, you're like, oh, Cooper Kupp, he only has 4 points. And then Stafford comes in on a game-winning drive. This is a guy who leads the league over the last decade in game-winning drives more than any other active quarterback, including Tom Brady, including Matt Ryan, including Drew Brees.
That's surprising. Lions have won games? That's crazy.
Matt Stafford leads the league in game-winning drives. So I think there's going to be situations where you look, Cooper Kupp 4 points, and then after that game-winning drive, you're like, oh, he got 16, he saved my week.
Yeah, I mean, to me, like, first of all, congratulations, Matt Stafford. You got out of Detroit. You got to a team with a winning culture. Good for you. Like, phenomenal. It's going to be exciting. It's going to be an exciting year for you. What an exciting time to be alive. But yeah, I think the outlook for Stafford is great. I think he's going to be pushing for that top 12 quarterback range in fantasy football. He's going to be one of those guys you can probably get in the mid to late rounds because he doesn't have the rushing upside that's still going to deliver. So I love waiting and grabbing Stafford in the middle rounds of drafts this year. As far as Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp go, I don't think there's a lot of new stuff to be said. I mean, they're going to be super steady, solid, top 24 PPR or half PPR wide receivers. They're high floor plays. They do have a little bit of upside as well. If you can grab them as your wide receiver 2 or your flex, if you're building out a really strong roster elsewhere, I think they're phenomenal. I think Stafford is definitely an upgrade for these 2 guys in this offense. But it's kind of business as usual for Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp. I think they're going to be the guys that you've drafted them to be for the past 2 or 3 seasons. But I think the much more interesting guys to talk about here, Steph, are actually Tyler Higbee and Van Jefferson. First, I want to hit on Van Jefferson because I wasn't really in on Van Jefferson as a rookie. Doesn't pop off the page. Like, you hear Van Jefferson, you're like, oh, did he even play last year? And in a weird way, I am rising.
Dude, you were blowing my mind because I had the exact same thing written in my notes here as well.
As a sleeper, I hadn't really looked into him a lot. I think he just was literally completely forgotten about. And the more I started looking into Van Jefferson, what he actually did last season, his prospect profile, his opportunity in this offense, I'm like, okay, I'm starting to like him a little too much for 2021. And he's a guy you're going to be able to get in deep double-digit rounds. I scooped him up in a dynasty league recently. I've been drafting him in best ball. If you're in a dynasty league, I know we're out of dynasty talk. Send out a 2022 third for Van Jefferson. Just take a flyer on him. Worst case scenario, you light a third-round pick on fire. But let's talk about Van. Round 2 draft capital just last season. I know he's a little bit older, pushing 25 years old, only in his second year, but he has fantastic size and speed. He's 6'2", 200, runs a 4.39 40-yard dash. And you talked about it, Steph. Matt Stafford loves pushing the ball down the field. Jared Goff hasn't pushed the ball down the field. And I think part of that might be Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp aren't downfield threats. Now, I know the Rams brought in Tutu Atwell. I know they brought in Deshaun Jackson. But I think they fit that profile of like a true speed burner. You're on the field to do one thing, a Mecole Hardman type player in Tutu and Deshaun Jackson. But Van Jefferson could be the Marvin Jones of this offense. I mean, Van Jefferson, 6'2", 200.
Wow.
Marvin Jones is also 6'2", 200. The exact same size. And MJJ is one of those guys year in and year out who never was like that guy going in the top 4 rounds as a stud wide receiver. But he has been a value for like 6 years straight. He's probably going to be a value this year in Jacksonville.
We'll talk about him
But that
later.
could be Van Jefferson, a guy who I don't think is going to break out to potential superstar level. But you could get this guy who you end up putting in your flex spot, who you end up putting in your wide receiver 2 spot, that could finish the season with some really, really good numbers. He wasn't super involved as a rookie, but he did show some flashes. In Week 17, had 4 receptions for 50 yards. In the divisional round of the playoffs, had 6 catches, 46 yards, and a touchdown in high leverage situations. So he got more involved as the season went on. The Rams seem to like this guy, and Matt Stafford's going to need that bigger body target down the field. So Van Jefferson, sneaky sleeper for 2021.
Van Jefferson's really interesting to me because his skill set's almost like a mix of Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp. And I don't see him as really a downfield threat at all. Hopefully he can develop that part of his game. We know he has the speed to be able to do that. But this is a guy that could play the slot. He played 19% of his snaps in the slot last season. They could also put him in the outside where he played the other 81% of his snaps. So if either one of these guys go down and we're in the middle of the season and Van Jefferson's available on waivers, he's a guy that everyone's going to be bidding on. So definitely a guy you can take a dart throw on, a name to keep an eye on if we start the year out and he's on waivers. But Alex, let's talk about your boy Tyler Higbee, because I think you were just a year too early last season. You were all over the Tyler Higbee hype train after that insane tear to end 2019. But as I'm looking around at who I want this year as a late round tight end, if I don't get one of the top 3 or 4 guys, I'm looking at Tyler Higbee. I'm like, this guy should be locked in for top 10 at the tight end position. Now, that's not saying much. That's not going to win you your league. But this is a guy that is going to be a top 10 name in fantasy that you can get in the 12th round in some of these drafts. And Gerald Everett is now out of the picture. He's gone. He went to Seattle. Last year, Gerald Everett had 62 targets to Tyler Higbee's 60 targets. I think it'd be silly to say that, look, let's just move the 62 targets from Gerald Everett over to Tyler Higbee. But even if he gets half of those, now we're talking about Tyler Higbee pushing 90 targets, which is exceptional for a tight end. I think he can be in that range. Another super deep name, this is more for Dynasty, Bryson Hopkins, the other tight end on the Rams. I think he's impressive. He's a young guy, super athletic. But Tyler Higbee, I think, is a huge value right now. And the Rams are still clearly in win-now mode, as they have been the last 3 seasons since McVay came to town. I think the volume may be a bit game script dependent. I don't necessarily want to lock in Matthew Stafford for over 600 pass attempts because the Rams' defense is phenomenal as well, with Aaron Donald, with Jalen Ramsey. Their schedule is a little bit tough to start the season. They have Chicago, Indianapolis, and Tampa Bay the first 3 weeks. But then after that, it's going to be an incredible stretch. Listen to these next couple games. Arizona, Seattle, New York Giants, Detroit Lions, the Texans, and the Titans. So should be a lot of shootouts, a lot of soft defensive matchups. I'm plugging in Cam Akers everywhere. I'm getting Matt Stafford at value. I'm plugging in Woods and Kupp as wide receiver 2s. I'm taking the flyer on Van Jefferson, and I'm grabbing Tyler Higbee late. You got to love a lot of these names in this offense.
One last thing on Higbee. I won't take up too much time. It's weird because I feel like we've switched roles here. Like I was all over Higbee last season, but fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I don't know if it was Gerald Everett. I think it was the role for Higbee because as someone who drafted him in a lot of places last year, I watched a lot of the Rams games and their snaps. And Higbee was on the field a ton, 78% of snaps, 8th in snaps at the tight end position. He was just used as a blocker. That was just the role he had in the offense. I mean, Gerald Everett only played 55% of snaps to Higbee's 78%, and they both averaged the same amount of targets per game. So if he's going to move into being the only tight end target on this team, it could be great. I think where he's being drafted right now, totally fair and could provide some upside to that value. But if they funnel those Gerald Everett targets to Van Jefferson, to Bryson Hopkins, to Jacob Harris, who's another guy they drafted, it could be more of the same for Higbee being used as that blocking role. So that's all I'm going to say on Higbee. I think he could end up being a good value. I mean, double-digit rounds, you're not losing much if he doesn't pan out. But I'm not quite as bullish on him this year, obviously, as I was last year.